The number you have reached, 911, has been changed to a non-published number.
Yo, what's up, family? This your dog, the Ultra Melanite, coming to you live once again from Charleston, South Carolina, home of the Geechee Gullah culture, aka the Holy City. And today we're going to be continuing our journey for self-identification using proper education, which was not given to us by our institutes. And in the process of doing so today, we will also debunk the slave trade. So let's go ahead and jump right into it and get started. As always, I want to get started with a short grammar lesson, etymology lesson, just to get your mind going. You should know by now that grammar is actually the total identification of the world around you. All right. What you probably don't know is the definition of etymology. Etymology is actually the study of the history of the words, their meanings, their roots, and how they have changed over time. So let's do the etymology of the word etymology. Let's break it down. Etymology contains two Greek words. It comes from the Greek word etym, which means true self, and the Greek word logia, which means the study of. So the literal Greek translation of the word etymology should mean the study of true self. It is perverted over time and translated into English as the study of the words, the history of the meanings, the roots and their stems, and how they change over time. So that's a short example of how a word can get perverted over a translation or over a long period of time, such as from the Greek language to the English language. You dig it? Let's take a couple of more simpler words and break them down just to get your mind going a little bit. Let's take the word Puerto Rico. All right. Puerto Rico is a Latin word and contains two words. The first word is puerto, which translates into English as port, and the second word is rico, which translates into English as riches. So the literal English translation of the word Puerto Rico should mean port of riches. All right. So by that being said, let's take another word, Costa Rica. All right. What is the grammar behind the word Costa Rica? What is the English literal translation? And that would be Costa equals coast and Rica equals riches. So the literal English translation of Costa Rica should mean coast of riches. With that being said, we should have already identified the fact that the word Rico or Rica from Latin to English means riches. So I asked the question, what does the word Africa mean? Africa. All right, since we know that it was also named by the Latins. How about America? Since we know that it was also named by the Latins. Both of them contain the suffix rica, so it means something pertaining to the riches. All right, just something for you to think about, and we'll delve into that at a later time. So let's get going with debunking the slave trade. In order to debunk the slave trade, we must first understand the true definition of the meaning of the word slave. So let's do the etymology of the word slave first. The earliest forms of the word slave that I can find comes from the biblical account in Egypt, and it is the word bondsman. So remember, every time you hear the word bondsman, that bondsman is synonymous with slaves. The next account that I can find was the Latin account of a group of people in Eastern Bloc Europe that they called the Slavs. They called them the Slavs because they spoke what the Latins identified as a Slavic language, which translates into the people who speak meaningfully. All right. It is Indo-European in origin from Slovo, like Slovenia or Slovakia, and means those who speak meaningfully. After Latin dominance of the Eastern Bloc, the Slavs became the working class people. There was another group of Slavs that were called by the Latins the Serbs. Remember that the V in English makes a B sound in Latin languages. So the word for us would be serve. The Latin word serb is directly related to the word servus, which means to guard or protect. The word was perverted in Latin to the word servant and used to describe someone who works for you. The word became coloni during the Middle Ages. Coloni, which has the root colonist, colony, cologne, etc., were the local workers of these Latin states. As chattel slavery ended in Europe, The coloni ended up with the same social status as the chattel slaves, and they were all now simply called the serfs. So serf is synonymous with the word slave also. Serfs were pretty much the blue-collar working class citizen. Alright? The English adaptation of the word slave is used to identify all people who are reduced to servitude. Alright? It means a person who is legal property of another entity and forced to obey them. Synonyms of the word slave is the word slav, serb, servant, vassal, thrall, bondsman, etc. By today's terms, it is the same as the word labor, servant, such as civil servant, employee, citizen, etc. They all share the same definition, a person who is forced to work and obey for an entity, such as the government. So if you fall under any of these categories, in layman's terms, by definition, you are a slave. Etymology tells us that the word slave used to refer to a group of Indo-European people in the Eastern Bloc, but now refers to anybody who was reduced to servitude. By this point, you should understand the definition of a word slave. If not, press rewind, grab a dictionary, or your Google search on your phone, and research the word for yourself. Start all over and listen at it again until it starts to sink in. There's a lot of words that is synonymous with the word slave. So by simply saying the word slave, we need to know what class or what level of slaves these people were. Were they the incarcerated former slave, or were they just a simply working class citizen? Understand that a citizen is forced to obey the rules of their government, so they are, in layman's terms, a slave. All right? Make sure you understand that fully before moving forward. The next step in debunking the transatlantic slave trade is understanding the triangular trade. The triangular trade was the trade that existed between Africa, the Americas, and Europe. Understand that Europe was the last player to enter the triangular trade in the year 1492. 1492 was a great year for the Europeans, as that was the year that they defeated the last Moorish stronghold in Spain, which was Granada, giving them the ability and the access to the old Moorish ports, and also the ability to make it to the New World. That is also the year that Christopher Columbus or Christopher Colon made it to the New World. All right. In 1492, Christopher Colon sailed the ocean blue. Notice that Christopher Columbus's surname is actually Colon in Spanish, and it is the synonym for slave, serf, etc. Colonization also has the same root. All right. Evidence states that Colon learned about the New World from the Africans, from what you call the Moorish Empire, which is a term I don't like to use, but for sake of the argument, we call them the Moorish Empires. It would be illogical to think that Colon traveled here back and forth to his point of origin just off of a hunch. People who knew the ocean very well had trouble traversing it, as it was evidenced by the Melanesian stories that states that they made several trips and lost several ships. The Atlantic Ocean to this day is still a very rough ocean to try to traverse. All right? Colon was a sailor who became involved with the trade off of the coast of Africa. The Portuguese and the Spanish had established ports everywhere, as they were in the process of controlling the Moorish empires. In 1492, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile decided to marry their two families together to get enough strength to defeat the last Moorish stronghold on the Spanish peninsula, like, as I said, Granada. Now you have the black empires of Africa, the Moors, and Europe and in other areas being ruled by European leaders who used the Moorish logic to consolidate these European states into powerful empires such as Portugal and Spain. Colon landed in the Bahamas, the Antilles, Venezuela, and Central America, and claimed them all for the crown of Castile. Colon first came with 3 scout ships and later returned with over 70 warships. He is reported as calling the people Una gente en Dios, a people of God, which now translates into Indian, the indigenous copper-colored people or sunburnt people of the Americas. These people called the island themselves Ghana-Hili. Notice that the name Ghana or Ghana within the word Ghana-Hini. Colon eventually became the governor of these islands through the power of the crown, which he thought at the time was a part of Asia. He initiated the genocide of the Taino and the Arawak peoples through war and enslavement. The men were killed and captured, and the women were taken as wives. Remember, as I said, the islands were already set up as a trading post for trade between Africa and the Americas prior to the European gaining control of the first ports off of the African coast and then the American coast. He noticed that the natives had scars on his chest, and the natives explained to him that sometimes the people from the mainland would come to the islands and attack them. There's two big significant things to pick up from that. First, this shows us that the mainlanders had the capability and the technology to reach the islands and make it back to their original settlements. A person like me today, right here from South Carolina, I couldn't go jump on a boat, hop in the water, make it to Jamaica, go raid them, and then make it back to my home in Charleston. I wouldn't know where I was at. You understand? So these people obviously had the knowledge and the capability of doing that. Second, this shows us that there were things on the island that were worth taking. Because I'll say it again, it was already set up as a trading post. You know, why would the mainlanders go to the island to raid them if there was nothing on the island to raid? You know, so, that's two significant things to pick up from that. Next, Cologne noticed that the people had on gold ornaments, earrings, bracelets, etc. Significant things about this shows us that the people had a knowledge of mining metal. Second, it shows us that the people had a knowledge of metal working and forging if they were able to make ornaments. Cologne made them show them where their gold source were. He documented how easily these people could be made prisoners and began taking the natives back to Spain to learn his language. That way it would be easier for him to defeat these people and enslave them, He is documented as saying that he can take over that whole island with 50 men. He made a total of 4 voyages, leaving his men and taking natives along the way. He, within 10 years, had total control of all of the parts and enslaved the people. And now the people were forced to obey the crown. That's the form of slavery that these people were subject to. They were made pretty much citizens of the crown. All right, Portuguese or as part of the Spanish Empire. The more warlike Carib Indians were all but annihilated by Columbus as he returned with his warships. Colon is known for the genocide of the American islanders. He was later arrested and tried for his brutal actions, but was released soon after. It should be safe to say that the Latin countries ruled their colonies in the same manner that they ruled their homeland, which was through the idea that the crown owned everything within this territory. So if you work your sugarcane fields for the crown, at any time they can come and annex it and take all of your product. That means that you were not free, but you had limited freedoms and you were, subject to some form of slavery. There were many other Latin explorers that came after Columbus, such as Henry de Soto, who were documented as capturing the indigenous black Americans and transporting them to the islands for re-education, and then returning them back to the mainland afterwards to be integrated into their Latin society. A perfect example would be the Walkama, who were captured here in South Carolina, 200 of them, and shipped to the islands, the island of Hispaniola to be exact. Though most of them did not survive the trip, they died. 180 of them died. The intention was for them to be returned to the mainland and be integrated back into their society. That's the whole process that they had of building settlements. Understand that the Latin people didn't have any standing settlements in the United States outside of Florida. So let's keep that in mind as we go forward. Keep in mind that the Latins were the first European to enter the New World, and the only standing settlement in the United States at this time was Florida. All right, let's move forward. The English didn't enter the playing field of the triangular trade until about 1555, 1565, with a guy named John Hardy Hawkins and his cousin Sir Francis Drake. John Hardy Hawkins was a pirate. He made his living privateering off of the coast of Africa. All right, he entered England in the triangular trade by hijacking Portuguese ships, enslaving the people, which became POWs, and then taking them to the islands to be sold. He made a big profit for the crown and ended up helping Queen Elizabeth build a very strong navy. He eventually led the way against the Spanish Armada and the English defeat of the Spanish. By now, you should realize that the English involvement with the triangular trade was initiated through piracy and privateering. By the early 1600s, you should realize that the Latin countries had already established colonies in Mexico, the southern U.S., and eastern South America. The English or Nordic type Europeans began to enter the United States through Virginia, where they waged a brutal war on the indigenous people, killing and incarcerating the men and keeping the women for procreation, as women are the number one resource needed to build a strong community. Understand that the Europeans made peace with some tribes and made war with other tribes. Once the warring tribes were subdued, the Europeans started to bring in workers or slaves from Europe or Africa to assist with the building of the colonies. The first immigrant slaves entered the United States in 1619 and were labeled as indentured servants, which means that they work a contract average of 7 years, after which they receive property and an opportunity to employ indentured servants of their own. At this point, it was still illegal to force someone to work for you permanently. Understand this, I'll say it again. In 1619, when the first indentured servants came over here, it was illegal to force someone to work for you permanently. All right. In Virginia, 20 African slaves were documented as being brought in 1619 as indentured servants, and all worked and were granted limited freedoms as they were considered freedmen once their servitude was over, and granted 50 acres of land. Slavery as an institution was still reserved for criminals and POWs at that time. It was an incarcerated form of slavery. You should compare it to somebody being in jail or in the penitentiary. It wasn't until 1655 when John Caser, an African indentured servant, was denied his freedom by a black slave owner named Anthony Johnson. The royal court in Virginia, which was ruled by the English, ruled that Anthony Johnson had the right to enslave Caser permanently. So the first example of slavery in the English Americas, or of permanent slavery in the English Americas, was a black man owning another black man, so they say. All while this was going on, the indigenous population engaged in constant war with the invading colonists, all eventually being subdued, and then the groups that most helped the colonists, came to be the ruling class of these other slaves. Over the next 200 years, the states passed legislation restricting blacks from owning land, furthering their status as laborers, workers, and slaves. All right. What that did is just kept them at the bottom of the economic totem pole and did not allow them to climb higher into the English rights of royalty. All right. Understand that at this point in time, no one can own land. The Americas was ruled by England, and the English was a system set up where the royal family owned all of the land. So it was impossible for people to own land. What some people had was land grants. They had land granted to them by the English government, but the English government can come in at any time and annex these people's land. All right. Being modest, to say upwards of 500,000 Africans were brought here. 90% of them would have had to been men. So by their own logic, even if these people procreated, it would have had to been with indigenous women. Furthermore, incarcerated people do not procreate. Thus, a major limit on the extensions of these people's gene pools into the indigenous people of America. That's very, very simple logic. Shouldn't be hard to understand. Incarcerated people don't make babies, not on an average. Like I said earlier, I'm being modest with the amount of Africans brought over here at 500,000. So let's see what the experts have to say about this subject. Although I don't 100% agree with the guy, I'm going to cite Dr. Lewis Henry Gates, who graduated from Yale and now works for Harvard and is a leading historian on African American culture. According to Dr. Gates, 388,000 Africans arrived in North America directly from Africa and another 60,000 from the islands. Remember, their own logic stated that the indigenous Americans were shipped to the islands and then back to the Americans, as did the European indentured servants, as ancestry research that I've done myself proves this to be true for many white families. But even though there would be no way to separate the two groups from coming to America, I'll give them the extra 60,000 Africans since I'm so generous. All right. Now note that Dr. Gates also states that most of these slaves arrived in the 19th century and that he found it amazing that the tiny number of slaves could produce a population of millions. That's not amazing, Dr. Gates. That's impossible, my man. By that logic, there should be more of us in the islands, Mexico, and especially Brazil, as some numbers show that Brazil got 5 times the amount of Africans as the North Americans. So, we know that that's not true because Brazil's population nowadays is over 80% mulatto. They don't look like us, which that mulatto thing fits the logic of the genocide and then intermixing with the indigenous black woman. All right. Second problem with this 388,000 comes in when you gather the fact that most of them came in the 1800s. By their own census reports, there were over 1 million blacks documented in the U.S. by 1800. Remember, the African slave groups were mostly composed of men and some POWs or some people who were simply incarcerated and could not procreate. Also think about the amount of people that would have been undocumented. The 1790 census makes no mention of the term Indian as an ethnic group, only free whites, free non-whites, and slaves. The 1820 census documents whites, coloreds, and slaves. So my question to you was, what were the Indians being called in 1820? The Indians were being called colored in the 1820s. All right. In 1850, it went from colored to black. So the classes were white, black, and mulatto. All right. So in the 1850s, the Indians were classified as blacks and mulattoes. And we know that a mulatto is the mixture between a white and a black person. Also realize that they added the term mulatto in 1850, which correlates with the term Native American. In 1860, they added the term Indian. Notice how the term Indian was added after the formation of the Native American and the mulatto. So prior to 1860, all indigenous American groups were labeled as blacks, colored, or mulatto. Indian was a term added after all of the other terms had been established. Most of these people who claim to be Native Americans have a black or colored descendant on the census, unless they are a product of the $5 Indian, where the European can pay a couple dollars to be identified as an Indian and gain the rights to this land. The slave class in the Americas were the indigenous black Americans who were the victims of genocide, no different than my brothers in Tasmania. And I like to bring up Tasmania because it was an example of this same type of thing going on in modern history where we can actually research it. And you will see that the indigenous Tasmanians were enslaved on their land and were victims of genocide. That same thing happened to us over here in America. The African slave trade had very little effect on modern blacks in the Americas, as evident with Brazil, like I said earlier, who had more Africans brought there than 5 times the amount of Africans brought there than the North Americans. So and right now they have less blacks than us, which does not fit the logic of what they're trying to teach us. All right? It doesn't make any sense. They simply changed the classification and names and confused the people. For example, in South Carolina in 1685, there were documented as 10,000 red people. They were documented as being 500 black people, and they documented 1,400 white people. By 1790, the Negro Acts of South Carolina, there were only 300 red people documented, 108,000 black people documented, and 140,000 white people documented. All right. By these documents and that logic, the red people would have been eradicated by 1800, as their population never increased over the period between 1685 and 1790. Their population, according to the census, was losing 100 people per year or 1,000 people per 10 years. Notice that the red and the black South Carolinians were eventually merged into one group, just like I explained earlier when I talked about the coloni and the service in the Latin countries in Europe. It would be impossible for the African population to grow and the indigenous American population to decline, especially when you factor in that most of the 388,000 Africans brought here were brought here in the 1800s, after South Carolina had already banned the import of African workers, similar to how we regulate work visas to this day. You think about it, if we have a problem with employment in America where people can't find jobs, then we put a limit on work visas. We don't want too much people coming from other country and stealing the jobs from the people from this country. The same type of deal was going on back then. It's no different, just a different grammatical term that was used. All right. I can't speak for other states, States. But the ancestry research that I've done on the blacks in South Carolina shows no evidence of the descendants arriving here as immigrants. And most of their ancestry at least dates back to the 1800s at some point, when Dr. Gates explicitly said that, you know, most of the 388,000 Africans that were brought here in the 1800s. All right. On the other hand, I found several records of white people coming here as immigrants from Europe and the islands as slaves or indentured servitudes. Lastly, the 388,000 Africans could have only been represented by less than 200,000 on the census, and then you also have to factor in the 3/5 of a person act, which allowed for all slaves to be counted as 3/5 of one person due to a compromise that they signed in 1787. That compromise was not lifted until 1868 after the creation of the Native Americans, which was all strategically done to ensure the indigenous black Americans would be successfully integrated into European society and forced to pay taxes and obey governmental laws. By calling you anything but an indigenous native black American, you give up your rights to this land, according to them anyway. We are the indigenous black families of America, which I'll prove in my next video by showing y'all my proven ancestry. I'll also touch into the topic of that Sub-Saharan DNA that they always try to use to combat us when we show these ancient relics. All right, so I'll go into a little depth about the Sub-Saharan DNA also. Peace out, family. Representing from the home of the Geechee Gala, Charleston, South Carolina, aka the Holy City. I'll holler at y'all the next time.